Welcome back to the podcast. I am pleased to bring on Paul Kupperberg. Tell fans why they should know who Paul Kupperberg is as a creator.
If they're under 50, I don't know that they will, but I've been around comics since the 1970s. I did a lot of work for DC Comics throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s and was an editor at DC. And then after that, I wrote the Life with Archie series, which you referred to before, where I got to create this alternate universe for the Archie characters, where we saw what happened in one reality if he married Betty, and the other if he married Veronica. And I got to wind that up with killing the little bastard off.
Did you always want to write for comic books?
There was no alternative. I never left myself any alternative path.
How old were you when you started creating comic books?
Professionally, I was 19.
You were one of that group of people going back to the late 60s, the Marv Wolfmans, the Jerry Conways, who got lucky enough to actually have their fanboy dream come true and write at a relatively early age. So you had a first published, if I'm correct, is 1975 for Charlton Comics of Scary Tales.
Oh, it was great. I actually remember the day I was waiting for the bus. I went to Brooklyn College. I was an English major at Brooklyn College, and I was waiting at the transfer point for the bus to take me to class. And there was a candy store, soda fountain kind of place on the corner. That was the main source for comic books, with candy store, news racks, and drugstores. But anyway, I had sold several scripts to Charlton, but I didn't know when they were going to be published. So I would just go in every week and look at the new Charlton comics and flip through them to look for my stories. And so I did that. I went in and there was Scary Tales #3, and I flipped it open, and there it was right there. And it was the first story. It was I'm standing in this candy store where people are just coming in and buying cigarettes and gum and newspapers and shit. They're just moving on. They don't care. And I'm standing there going, look, that's me. That's, and people are throwing change at me and telling me not to hurt them. So it's Brooklyn. You have to understand.
Did you do much work for Charlton back then?
Half a dozen stories for them. And then I started selling to DC, which had triple the page rate, which isn't as impressive as it sounds because the page rate at Charlton was $5 a page. But once I started writing for DC, it was like, this makes more sense to focus my energy here.
To me, Charlton Comics was always the little comic book company that could, because they started back in the golden age and lasted right through the bronze age. They were notoriously bad with the way it printed and how it paid its artists, but they chugged along for decades.
That's exactly how I've always referred to them, the little comic book company that could. They were in Derby, Connecticut, not far from where I live now. And in fact, I've been to the site. Unfortunately, the factory is no longer there. It's a strip mall now, but it was just a factory building. And on one end was the editorial business offices. And there would be guys like Joe Gill would be sitting there typing scripts and tossing them over his shoulder to whoever walked in the door and picked them up. Steve Ditko, Dick Giordano, it doesn't matter. And then they had a production. The artist would bring the stories back in, and they had production on premises, and they would pass that on to, I don't know if they did their own engraving. They probably did their own engraving, their own color sets on premises too. The business offices were in New York, but all the engravers and printers originally were in Connecticut. They had their own printing presses.
They're the only company that had their own printing press.
Everybody else was printing in a company in Sparta, Illinois, World Color Press. And the printing was not great, and they used the cheapest paper possible, and they just pushed it out the door. At the other end, they had their shipping department, which was their own trucks, which went out and distributed the comics. So they literally, from slaughtering the pig to putting the packaged sausages on the shelf, they were doing it all. But even though they paid for crap, they left the creators alone because they didn't care what they published.
All they cared about was keep them printing presses running 24/7.
That's right.
That's why, like Steve Ditko, after he left Marvel, went there because he said, "Do whatever you want, Steve."
Steve was there. There was Pat Boyette, Tom Sutton, a whole bunch of artists who just, we'll go there because they leave us. Like, even when an artist got a script, John Byrne was early on, he was doing, I think, Doomsday +1. He got a script, a Joe Gill script, and he wanted to make a few changes. He called Joe and said, would you mind if I did this, that, or the other thing? And Gill's response was pretty much, I don't care. I've already been paid. I don't even remember the story. So it was just such a laissez-faire attitude that a lot of these guys just stuck around for that reason. And of course, guys like Boyette and Steve Ditko could have gone anywhere, but Boyette and Sutton were always kind of hard sells in mainstream comics, unfortunately. Brilliant artists, not Kurt Swan, Jack Kirby, superhero standard.
Mike Zeck's first job was the same story that you wrote.
His first story. I think he
No,
had already been working for Charlton for a year or two and had done some stories.
you've only done one Marvel comic story, as far as I can tell. You wrote Captain America 290 back in 1990. I believe it was
Yeah.
drawn by your brother Alan. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It was
Wow.
not a good story. Alan got the gig, and no, Alan didn't get the gig. I was writing for Crazy Magazine. I wrote a bunch of stuff for Crazy. Back then, for the editor was Paul Lakin at the time, and I wrote the Star Wars parody, which was a gig that Alan got to write and draw. But for some reason, he didn't write it. I wound up writing it, scripting it, and Alan drew it, Star Wars, because it was Crazy Magazine. I'd done a few other things for them, and I was up. And of course, let's expand my market. And anyway, the Captain America thing turned out to be not good, and it got made even worse when Alan sabotaged me somehow. Alan had a want to do that. He was not my best pal. He was not. Anyway, the only time I ever wrote anything other than Crazy for Marvel after that, directly for Marvel, was a Savage Sort of Conan story in the early 90s.
Is there any reason why you didn't do anything for Marvel?
I didn't have the same feeling for the characters. I was always a DC kid. When I started reading comics, Marvel didn't even exist. I started reading comics before Fantastic Four #1. I was born in 1955. I was 7, 8 years old before Marvel came into my consciousness. Meanwhile, I'd been reading, been seeing and reading all the Superman, and Wonder Woman back then was a weird kiddie book almost. It was by Bob
Yes.
Kanigher and Andrew Esposito, and the stories were fairy tale-ish, and it had genies and
Wonder.
dragons and Wonder Girl and Bird Boy and Mer Boy. It had a genie as a recurring character. It had Egg Foo. Come on.
Different than the Wonder Woman we have today.
Thank goodness.
I believe I did my homework correctly because you've already shot me down a couple of times, so I feel like a terrible researcher. But your first story, if I'm right, was in Weird War Tales 51, 1977 at DC, right? Is that correct?
You know what? It may have been the first one published.
Okay.
The first one that I wrote for DC was for Superman Family. It was a World of Krypton story that Marshall Rogers drew.
I love the Superman Family series.
It was a fun book. It had Superman, it had Supergirl and Superboy and Crypto and Mr. and Mrs. Superman. I did the Nightwing and Flamebird feature.
Did you ever think you would like flame out early and go, oh man, these people are never, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to be done? And did you ever think about, did that ever cross your mind? Like you would
No, I
be,
don't think that didn't worry me.
how about during the 90s when you had the rise of the internet and magazines like Wizard, where some of these creators became almost like rock stars?
By the time that started happening, I was already moved out of writing and more into started editing at DC in 1991. We didn't even get royalties when I started. Artists didn't get original art returned to them. During my very earliest times, the back of the check was stamped, had a stamp on it that by endorsing this check, you're signing away all your rights to this material. So it was this primitive copyright law was still in effect in those days where we actually had to endorse your check. In order to get paid, you had to sign away your rights. It was a very different time. And all this, so everything that came along after, all the superstardom, and I was like John Byrne, I think we can argue is probably one of the earliest superstars, him in Claremont. And I was friendly with John at the time and saw what goes on around that. And John certainly didn't need it. I would have liked the money, I would have liked the sales, but all things being equal, okay.
Why should newer fans check out these Bronze Age Superman stories?
Every era has their characters, and if they're interested, it was a different take on Superman. It was a more magical look at it. We still gave pseudoscientific explanations for things. We accepted if Superman needs to move the Earth, he just needs to push real hard. And it's still fantastical. They will still move the Earth. They'll just, instead of doing it in 2 panels, they'll make it into 3 issues, and they still won't take it into account physics. But anyway, it was just a different era, a different way of telling stories, different stories being told.
So good stories back
Sure,
then?
for
Yeah.
the time, it's very easy to judge old stuff on modern standards. Without context, any kind of judgment is meaningless. It doesn't mean that Gone with the Wind, its attitude is any more acceptable because it's old and historic. It just means you have to understand that at the time it was made, everybody was like, "Oh, look, Hattie McDaniel won the Academy Award for this part, but she still had to sit at the back of them at the dinner and wasn't allowed." It was like you have to understand the era you're dealing with. If you want to look at the history of comic books, pretty fucking horrible industry.
You are indirectly responsible for the worst and best things about comic books. Indirectly now, the miniseries concept, because I believe you had the very first miniseries with World of Krypton in
Yes.
1979. Do you remember how that all came about?
It was originally done as a 3-issue arc for Showcase.
It was supposed to be, I think, in 104 through 108.
First, it was supposed to be 104, and then the Superman movie got pushed back on the schedule, and it was supposed to be conjunction with the Superman movie. So that got pushed back on schedule. So they pushed it back. But then Showcase got canceled. So they just stuck the World of Krypton in the drawer. And when the Superman movie finally came around, instead of whatever, they just said, do the mini. We'll throw it out there. There's a house ad selling it as a mini series. Get all 3 issues. Here's the on sale dates. And so, yeah, that's how it came about. This was the first time it was ever intentional. They had the Superman movie. DC didn't have a lot of product. That's why they published Elliot Magin's Last Son of Krypton. That was there. Elliot had already written that, and when they couldn't do a novelization, they went with that. Yeah, so that was just opportunity. That was just it happened. Research, frankly, my editor was E. Nelson Bridwell. It was built in. Nelson just was a walking encyclopedia of all that stuff. And I don't claim to be.
Did you pitch the idea?
I think it was an assignment. Yeah. Even Doom Patrol was Levitz came to me and said, we're reviving Showcase and we want to do Doom Patrol. And the only reason he came to me, because I'd been writing for 2 years. Paul and I were buddies. We had come up in the business together through fanzines. The only reason he came to me was because he knew A, Showcase was one of my absolute favorite titles ever published, and B, the Doom Patrol was my absolute favorite superhero group. And C, he knew I'd kill him if he didn't give me the gig. So yeah, that's why I got that. So yeah, the World of Krypton was just I had been writing the Nightwing and Flamebird stuff in Superman Family.
Why was E. Nelson Bridwell the editor for the Krypton versus Julius Schwartz, who was more of the Superman editor?
Oh, probably time, and probably the type of thing where Julie would look at it and go, "I don't want to deal with this crap." And
So how was Nelson as an editor?
he was obsessive. Yeah, again, he knew this stuff chapter and verse, and the next project I did with him, which was the third miniseries, The Legend of the Batman after the World of Krypton book.
Yeah.
And then the next one was the Secrets of the Legion of Superheroes that Nelson and I co-wrote.
Did you write much Legion?
I wrote a few stories. I dialogued 2 or 3 stories for Paul and wrote maybe 1 or 2.
Did you ever want to do more Legion?
I liked the book, but they weren't a particular. If I was going to do a group, I wanted to do Justice League. That was the Superman of superhero groups. That was the prize. But I only ever got to do one fill-in issue of that.
Oh, so you worked a lot with Julie Schwartz, correct? So what was it like working with Julie from somebody that actually knew him at the time?
He could be curmudgeonly. He liked to play Perry White from The Adventures of Superman, but he was a sweetheart. He had very definite ideas about how things should be done. And when you were new to his stable, I'd walk in and sit down and go, "Okay, I have an idea for Bizarro." And he'd go, "No, it's going to be Toy Man." And he's going to, and oh, okay, yes, sir. And I take notes. As time went on, he'd go, "All right, Bizarro." And then let me tell my story before he'd rip it apart. And finally, he'd actually let me do stories that I'd walk in and go, I'd pitch and he'd say, "I don't quite get it, but go ahead." just how to build trust with him. But he
Did
was
you have a
great. I
lot?
loved him.
Did you have a lot of disagreements with them?
I love the guy. I know he was difficult, and I know that he has sometimes a problematic reputation on some levels. But when I grew up reading comic books in the 1960s, I was a DC kid. Marvel fans had Stan and Jack and Steve. I had Julie and Carmine and Gil. Those were my guys. So Julie, he built the Silver Age. He ignited the Silver Age. Whatever else was going on, he did the Flash, which revived the Flash. Then he revived Green Lantern and Atom and Hawkman, and he did the Justice League book and Adam Strange. Just everything he touched was golden, certainly during the early 60s. When Batman was in trouble, they gave
Yeah,
it to.
again, wasn't it true that they were given like a 6-month mandate to flip the Batman around, or Detective and Batman are probably going to get canceled?
There
Was that
was, I think the rumor was Detective Comics was on the chopping block, but I've had like Paul Levitz has expressed doubt that was the case. But numbers, and we're talking about, geez, we fell below a 500,000, which in those days was a bad sign. It was in the 50s and early 60s, Batman was fighting aliens and scientific menaces, and Superman was fighting villains in suits. The Superman comics were trying to emulate the TV show, the George Reeves TV show. Editor Mort Weisinger was story editor. He knew that stuff. And Batman, again, it was all these scientific alien menaces. Then he took it back to the roots, literally with Gardner Fox, who was one of the earliest writers on Superman after Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So Gardner Fox was writing it, and he got rid of that kind of goofy Shelley Moldoff art. I loved it, but it was very cartoonish. And then suddenly Carmine Infantino was drawing the book. Talk about night and day. Carmine in later stuff suffered, but man, he was at his peak. He was at his peak at DC in the early mid 60s. That stuff he was doing was just killer. And so, anyway, Julie was the man. Julie was the guy. I always had an eye in my head no matter what I did until I wrote for Julie Schwartz.
when you were writing the Superman stories? How did you approach them, and did you try to do something different between like Superman and Clark Kent when you were writing them?
Most of the stuff I tried was in Supergirl and Superboy. Superman was pretty set, and Julie kept a
A
tighter
tight
rein.
rein.
I did a DC Comics Presents team up with Madame Xanadu. That it was one of those stories that I went, no, no, I don't get it, but a psychological, other dimensional thing. And he let me do it. And not only that, he gave it to Gray Morrow to draw. But I don't know if you're familiar with Gray Morrow's art, but he was he didn't do a lot of superhero stuff. He was more of a science fiction and fantasy artist. But I did a lot of illustrations for the science fiction magazines in the 50s and 60s and stuff. But just, I loved his stuff. And his Superman was just so different. He didn't draw a guy with a painted on Superman suit. He drew a guy wearing like a wool George Reeves Superman costume. His characters were just grounded in reality. You could feel the weight of the costume on the characters. Beautiful stuff. Julie would let me go on stuff like that and not question it.
Did you like to write the classic baddies, or did you like creating your own baddies?
Yeah, I wish I had written more of the classics. I think I used Luthor once or twice in Superboy. I don't know that I ever used him in Superman or Action Comics. I don't think I did a Bizarro story. I don't think I did a Metallo story. I wish I had done more legacy stuff with Superman. I was very surface with the character.
So, as a writer, were you writing like at times just to churn them out, or did you always take a great pride in what you were doing? How did you approach that?
There was a point where I was writing like 5, sometimes 6 books a month. I wouldn't say doing it for the money, but just do it. You're just churning it for the deadline. It eventually evolved a philosophy that I use as a title of a book, which is I never write for the money, but I always turn in the manuscript for a check. And really, I find it's true that will offer you a ridiculously low amount of money to do a project, but you'll do it because they're a friend or because it'll be fun or whatever. It really doesn't make any difference. I'm not working any different than I am for a good page rate.
What was the biggest lesson you learned from Julie Schwartz? Or
Be original. That was really, he actually had little pins that he handed out. B.O. Schwartz. It's the
that's
B.O. stood for Be Original. And I think a lot of the reason why I didn't do more legacy stuff now that we're circling back to this is he would refer to a lot of writers, the ones who were always digging up the old stuff. He would call them goddamn archaeologists. Don't be a goddamn archaeologist. Come up with something new. And yeah, I get it. They didn't want to create something new and give it away. Roy Thomas did all that digging because he wasn't giving Marvel Comics.
So over the years, what would you think would be your lasting contributions to the Superman legacy of characters, Superboy, Supergirl? What would you consider your legacy or contribution to it overall?
I came on to Superman at a time when, unfortunately, just at the point where I was being able to start to do things with the character. Superboy, I did at least get to address one or two of the little stupid bits about the character that always bothered me and to turn those around. That timid Clark Kent act. Like, have a scene where Clark goes, wait a second. If I hit a baseball, nobody's going to think I'm Superboy. Pete hit a baseball. Nobody said, Pete, you just hit the baseball. You must be Superboy. That's not the way people think. I can be a normal kid. And I gave him a girlfriend and that kind of thing, just to turn around those kind of stupid cliches that were an invention of a simpler time.
Paul, thank you for joining me on this podcast.